Ted Bundy, the killer next door. Imagine your daughter leaves for college, bright-eyed and excited about her future. She's careful, smart, not the type to take unnecessary risks. One day, she agrees to help a handsome young man carry some books to his car. He's wearing a cast on his arm, struggling with his load. He seems harmless, even charming. She wants to help. She's never seen again. This scenario played out dozens of times across America in the 1970s. The young man with the cast, or the crutches, or the friendly smile was Theodore Robert Bundy. To the outside world, he was a law student, a political volunteer, a crisis hotline counselor. He was handsome, articulate, and charismatic. He was the kind of man parents wanted their daughters to date. He was also one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Ted Bundy confessed to 30 murders, though investigators believe the true number could be much higher. But what made Bundy different from other serial killers wasn't just the body count. It was who he was. He didn't fit the stereotype of a serial killer as a loner, an outcast, someone obviously disturbed. Bundy was successful, educated, charming. He could have been anyone. He could have been your neighbor, your classmate, your friend. And that's what made him so terrifying. Because Ted Bundy proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the boy next door. Sometimes they smile at you, offer to help, make you feel safe right before they destroy you. This is the story of Ted Bundy. Not just a catalogue of his crimes, though we'll examine those. Not just a psychological profile, though we'll explore what made him what he was. This is a story about deception, about the mask of sanity worn by someone fundamentally broken. It's about how he evaded capture, escaped from custody twice, and turned his own trial into a media spectacle. And it's about the victims, the young women whose lives he stole, whose families still carry the weight of his crimes decades later. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. But his life began with a lie, the first of many lies that would define his existence. Ted's birth certificate listed his mother as Louise Cowell and his father as a salesman named Lloyd Marshall. But Lloyd Marshall never existed. Ted was illegitimate, born to an unmarried woman at a time when this carried significant social stigma. For the first years of his life, Ted was raised by his grandparents in Philadelphia, told that his mother Louise was actually his sister. This deception was eventually revealed when Ted was a child. Louise moved with Ted to Tacoma, Washington, where she met and married Johnny Bundy, a military cook. Johnny adopted Ted, giving him the surname Bundy. Louise and Johnny had several children together, creating a blended family that appeared normal from the outside. But Ted never felt he belonged. He resented his stepfather, whom he considered beneath him intellectually and socially. He was ashamed of his illegitimate birth, of the lies he'd been told, of what he perceived as his family's lower-class status. These resentments festered, creating a sense of alienation and rage that he learned to hide beneath a charming exterior. As a teenager and young adult, Ted Bundy seemed to be thriving. He was intelligent, good-looking, and socially adept when he wanted to be. He attended the University of Washington, studying Chinese. He volunteered for political campaigns, working for Republican candidates. He worked at a crisis hotline, ironically counseling people in emotional distress while harboring his own dark impulses. But beneath the surface, something was very wrong. Ted was obsessed with a young woman named Stephanie Brooks, whom he dated during college. Stephanie was everything Ted aspired to be: upper class, sophisticated, from a wealthy family. When she broke up with him, telling him he lacked ambition and direction, Ted was devastated. This rejection became a defining moment in his psychology, fueling a rage against women that would later manifest in murder. What turned Ted Bundy from a resentful young man into a serial killer? The truth is, we may never fully know. Bundy himself gave contradictory accounts, sometimes blaming pornography, sometimes childhood trauma, sometimes simply his own choices. What we do know is that by the early 1970s, Ted Bundy had begun acting on violent fantasies that had probably existed in his mind for years. The first confirmed Bundy murder occurred on January 4, 1974. Joni Lenz, a student at the University of Washington, was attacked in her basement bedroom. She survived but was left with permanent brain damage and no memory of her attacker. Police found a metal rod that had been used in the assault, but no other evidence. 1 month later, Linda and Healy disappeared from her basement apartment near the University of Washington campus. Her bed was made, her nightgown laid out, her bicycle and belongings all in place. But Linda was gone. Blood was found on her pillow and mattress, but there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if she'd simply vanished. Over the next several months, young women began disappearing from college campuses across Washington state. Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball. All were attractive young women with long dark hair parted in the middle, a look that eerily resembled Stephanie Brooks, the girlfriend who'd rejected Ted years earlier. The cases had similarities. The women typically disappeared in the evening or at night. They were last seen near colleges or universities. They seemed to have vanished without a trace, leaving behind their belongings and no signs of struggle. Police began to suspect a serial predator, but they had no idea who or what they were looking for. Then came July 14, 1974, a day that would provide the first real clues to the killer's identity. Lake Sammamish State Park was crowded with beachgoers enjoying the sunny summer day. Multiple witnesses saw a handsome young man approaching young women, asking for help. He wore a cast on his arm and introduced himself as Ted. He had a sailboat, he said, and needed help loading it onto his car. Could they spare a few minutes to help him? Most women declined. But two didn't. Janice Ott and Denise Naslund both agreed to help the friendly young man with the broken arm. Both disappeared that day. Witnesses provided descriptions and even a sketch of Ted, but it wasn't enough to identify him conclusively. The disappearances continued. Ted Bundy had developed a method, a way of using his charm and fabricated vulnerability to lure victims. The cast, the crutches, the friendly demeanor, all were tools in his predatory toolkit. He was hunting with calculated precision, and young women were dying because they'd been raised to be helpful, to be kind, to trust a clean-cut young man who needed assistance. But Ted Bundy was getting careless, or perhaps overconfident. And in Utah, where he'd moved to attend law school at the University of Utah, his luck was about to run out. On August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving erratically in a residential neighborhood in Granger, Utah, at 2:30 in the morning. When Hayward tried to pull the car over, it sped away, running stop signs before finally stopping. The driver was Ted Bundy. When Hayward searched the car, he found items that immediately raised suspicions: handcuffs, a crowbar, an ice pick, a ski mask, rope, and trash bags. Bundy claimed the handcuffs were for restraining shoplifters when he'd worked security. The other items, he said, were just things he kept in his car. His explanations were smooth, practiced, but Hayward wasn't convinced. The items were documented, and Bundy was allowed to go with a warning. But Hayward's report triggered something. Detectives investigating recent disappearances and a kidnapping attempt in Utah began looking more closely at Theodore Bundy. His Volkswagen Beetle matched descriptions from witnesses. His appearance matched sketches. And there was something about him, something that set off alarm bells. In October 1975, Ted Bundy was placed in a lineup. Carol DeRonch, a young woman who'd escaped an attempted kidnapping in November 1974, identified him as her attacker. DeRonch's story was chilling. A man claiming to be a police detective had approached her at a shopping mall, telling her someone had tried to break into her car. When she went with him to file a report, he'd attempted to handcuff her and force her into his Volkswagen Beetle. She'd fought back and escaped, one of the few women to survive an encounter with Ted Bundy. Bundy was arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping. In March 1976, he was convicted and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. But Utah authorities suspected Bundy was responsible for much more than one kidnapping. They began building cases for murder, coordinating with investigators in Washington and Colorado where similar disappearances had occurred. In January 1977, Bundy was transferred to Colorado to face murder charges in the death of Karen Campbell, a young woman who disappeared from a ski resort in 1975. And this is where Ted Bundy's story takes a turn that seems almost too dramatic for fiction. Bundy was allowed to use the Pitkin County Courthouse Law Library to research his own case. He was acting as his own attorney, a decision that would later become central to his strategy. On June 7, 1977, during a court hearing, Bundy asked to visit the library. The guards allowed it, even removing his handcuffs and leg restraints since the library was on the second floor of the courthouse and they assumed he was secured. What happened next shocked everyone. Bundy opened a window and jumped. He landed on the ground below, injured his ankle, but kept running. He was free, loose in the Colorado mountains, and no one had any idea where he was going. The escape triggered a massive manhunt. Roadblocks were set up. Helicopters searched from the air. Hundreds of law enforcement officers combed the mountains. And for 6 days, Ted Bundy evaded capture, surviving in the wilderness, stealing food and supplies, managing to stay hidden despite the intensive search. He was recaptured on June 13, 1977, found driving a stolen car. He was disheveled, exhausted, and injured, but he was alive and the escape had proven something to him. He could outsmart the system. He could beat them. But Ted Bundy wasn't done escaping. He was returned to custody, this time in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Security was tightened, but it wasn't enough. Bundy was determined, resourceful, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. Over several months, Bundy lost weight deliberately, squeezing through his cell ceiling vent to see if he could fit. He gathered money from supporters who still believed in his innocence. He studied the guards' routines, looking for weaknesses. And on December 30, 1977, he made his move. During the Christmas season, many guards had taken time off, leaving the jail understaffed. Bundy, using a hacksaw he'd acquired, cut a hole in the ceiling of his cell. He climbed into the crawl space above, made his way to a guard's apartment within the jail complex, and simply walked out of the building wearing stolen civilian clothes. He stole a car and drove to Denver, then caught a flight to Chicago, and from there made his way to Florida. By the time authorities discovered he was gone the next day, Ted Bundy had a significant head start. He was free again, loose in a new state, and he was about to commit his most horrific crimes yet. Ted Bundy arrived in Florida on January 8, 1978. He was a fugitive from justice, one of the FBI's most wanted criminals, with warrants and alerts out across the country. A sensible person in his position would have laid low, avoided attention, tried to establish a new identity and disappear. Ted Bundy was not sensible. And he couldn't stop himself. On January 15, 1978, just 1 week after arriving in Florida, Bundy committed what would become known as the Chi Omega murders, the crimes that would finally end his freedom forever and cement his place in the pantheon of America's most notorious killers. The Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee was home to dozens of young women. Around 3 a.m. on January 15, Bundy entered the building through a back door that had been left unlocked. He moved through the house armed with a wooden club, entering rooms where the students slept. What happened over the next 15 minutes was a frenzy of violence. Margaret Bowman, 21, was attacked in her bed and killed. Lisa Levi, 20, was attacked in her room and also killed. The brutality of these murders was extreme, even for Bundy. 2 other women, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were attacked in their rooms but survived despite severe injuries. A witness saw a man leaving the Chi Omega house around 3 a.m., moving quickly, carrying something. But in the dark, they couldn't provide a detailed description. Inside the sorority house, the survivors began to realize something terrible had happened. Screams echoed through the building. Police were called. The scene they discovered was horrific. Less than an hour after the Chi Omega attacks, Bundy struck again just blocks away. Cheryl Thomas was attacked in her apartment, beaten severely but surviving with serious injuries including permanent hearing loss. The violence of the Florida attacks was different from Bundy's earlier crimes. These were frenzied, brutal, showing less of the careful planning that had characterized his previous murders. Some psychologists have suggested that Bundy, having escaped twice and living as a fugitive, was deteriorating psychologically, losing the control that had allowed him to maintain his facade for so long. On February 9, 1978, Bundy committed his final murder. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was abducted from her school in Lake City, Florida. Her body would be found weeks later in a state park. Kimberly was Bundy's youngest victim, and her death would become a central focus of his eventual trial. But Bundy's time was running out. He was driving a stolen vehicle, living in cheap motels, surviving on stolen credit cards. He was becoming reckless, careless in ways that his careful earlier self never would have been. On February 15, 1978, a police officer in Pensacola, Florida, noticed a suspicious orange Volkswagen and ran the plates. The car was stolen. The officer pulled it over and approached. The driver provided identification, but the officer wasn't convinced. A struggle ensued. The driver tried to escape but was subdued and arrested. Only later did the officer realize who he'd caught. The man in the stolen Volkswagen, fighting to escape one final time, was Theodore Robert Bundy, one of the most wanted fugitives in America. Ted Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders began on June 25, 1979, in Miami, Florida. It was one of the first trials to be televised nationally, and Bundy used the platform to its fullest extent, turning the courtroom into a stage for his final performance. Bundy represented himself, with court-appointed attorneys assisting him. He cross-examined witnesses, delivered opening and closing statements, and conducted himself with a confidence that both impressed and disturbed observers. Here was a man on trial for brutal murders, facing the death penalty, and he was treating it like an intellectual exercise, a game he was determined to win. The evidence against Bundy was substantial. Bite marks found on one of the Chi Omega victims matched his dental impressions, a relatively new but powerful form of forensic evidence. Witnesses placed him in Tallahassee at the time of the murders. Physical evidence connected him to the crimes. But Bundy was a skilled manipulator. He challenged the evidence, cross-examined witnesses aggressively, and presented himself as a victim of overzealous prosecution. He was charming, articulate, and seemingly rational. Some trial watchers found themselves almost forgetting what he was accused of doing. The prosecution methodically built their case. They presented the forensic evidence, the witness testimony, the timeline of events. They described the brutality of the attacks, the terror of the survivors, the loss felt by the families of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levi. Through it all, Bundy remained confident, even smug. He gave interviews to reporters, discussing his case, analyzing the evidence, presenting himself as a wrongly accused man caught in a justice system that had decided on his guilt before the trial began. On July 23, 1979, the jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Bundy declined. The penalty phase of the trial began immediately. The same jury that had convicted him would now decide whether he should live or die. Bundy, representing himself, had the opportunity to make a case for his life. He failed. On July 31, 1979, the jury recommended death. Judge Edward Cowart accepted the recommendation and sentenced Ted Bundy to die in Florida's electric chair. But Bundy wasn't done. There would be another trial, this one for the murder of Kimberly Leach. The evidence was strong. Witnesses had seen Bundy with the young girl, fibers from his clothing matched fibers found with her body, and his van had been forensically linked to the crime scene. Once again, Bundy was convicted. Once again, he was sentenced to death. And once again, he showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of his crimes. But even on death row, Ted Bundy continued to manipulate. He began giving interviews, providing information about his crimes, teasing investigators with hints about other victims. He became a consultant on serial killer cases, offering his insights into the criminal mind. He maintained relationships with psychologists and journalists, always controlling the narrative, always trying to be the smartest person in the room. He married Carol Ann Boone, a woman who'd worked with him and believed in his innocence, in a bizarre courtroom ceremony during his trial. She even gave birth to his daughter while he was on death row, though the circumstances of how that happened remain unclear and disturbing. For nearly 10 years, Bundy fought his death sentences with appeals, legal maneuvers, and occasional offers to provide information about unsolved murders in exchange for. The families of his victims endured years of additional pain as the legal process dragged on, as Bundy continued to be a presence in the news, in documentaries, in the public consciousness. But eventually, the appeals ran out. The stays of execution were exhausted. And on January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. His last words were to his attorney, "Jim, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." No words for his victims. No acknowledgement of their suffering. No real remorse. Just a final manipulation, presenting himself as a loving son and friend even in his last moments. Ted Bundy confessed to 30 murders before his execution, though investigators believe the true number could be much higher, possibly exceeding 100 victims. Young women across multiple states, their lives stolen, their families forever scarred. But Bundy's legacy extends beyond his body count. He changed how we think about serial killers, about evil, about the face that violence can wear. Before Bundy, the public image of a serial killer was often a disheveled loner, someone obviously disturbed, someone you'd cross the street to avoid. Bundy proved that wasn't always true. He showed that monsters can be charming, educated, successful. They can look like the boy next door. They can be people you trust, people you'd never suspect. This realization was terrifying but important. It changed how law enforcement approached serial crime investigations. It influenced how parents talked to their children about stranger danger, about the fact that dangerous people don't always look dangerous. Bundy also demonstrated the power of manipulation and charisma. His ability to defend himself in court, to attract supporters who believed in his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, to maintain relationships and even marry while on death row, all of this showed how a skilled manipulator could work the system and control narratives even from behind bars. The victims of Ted Bundy deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in his horrific tally, but as individuals whose lives had value and potential. They were daughters, sisters, friends. They had dreams and ambitions. They were kind enough to help a stranger with a broken arm, trusting enough to believe that a clean-cut young man asking for assistance was exactly what he appeared to be. Their deaths taught a painful lesson about trust, about the masks that evil can wear, about the reality that not everyone who smiles at you has good intentions. Ted Bundy has been dead for over 3 decades now, but his story continues to fascinate and horrify. Documentaries are made, books are written, his crimes are analyzed and debated. Some of this attention is morbid curiosity, but some of it serves a purpose. By understanding how Bundy operated, how he selected victims, how he used charm and deception, we can better protect potential future victims. By studying his psychology, by examining what made him capable of such evil, we can perhaps identify warning signs in others before they act on violent impulses. But we must also be careful not to romanticize Ted Bundy, not to let his charisma and intelligence obscure what he truly was. He was not a tragic anti-hero. He was not a misunderstood genius. He was a predator who destroyed lives, who felt no genuine remorse, who manipulated until his final breath. The real story of Ted Bundy isn't about him. It's about the women whose lives he stole. It's about the families who still carry their grief decades later. It's about the survivors who lived through his attacks and bore those scars forever. And it's about the lesson we must never forget, that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it smiles at you, offers to help carry your books, and walks beside you.